This is The Theory of Flight, a novel by Spiwe Gloria Ndlovu, read by Claire Baker. Prologue. On the 3rd of September, not so long ago, something truly wondrous happened on the Beaufort farm and estate. At the moment of her death, Imogen Zula Nyoni, Genie, was seen to fly away on a giant pair of silver wings, and at that very same moment her heart calcified into the most precious and beautiful something the onlookers had ever seen. A few had already been chosen to witness this event. However, most of you have eyes that are not for beauty to see, and because of this you will not believe that such a truly amazing phenomenon did take place. It is because some of you will have doubt, and those of you who do not have doubt will be curious, that this story is choosing to be told. Like any event, what happened to Genie did not happen in a vacuum. It was the result of a culmination of genealogies, histories, teleologies, epistemologies, and epidemiologies, of ways of living, remembering, seeing, knowing, and dying. In other words, the story of what happened to Genie on the Beaufort farm and estate on the 3rd of September is also the story of how Baines, in a bid to quench his wanderlust, walked into the Indian Ocean, of how Prudence Ngoma learned how to build character, of how Gol Gome shot down an aeroplane and in doing so created a race of angels, of how Elizabeth Nyoni sealed her fate with the turn of her ankle, of how Dingane Masuku came to be haunted by the blue-violet flowers on his mother's dress, of how Thandikadebe looked into the distance as though it held a future in which she was not particularly interested, of how Crystal Masuku, at puberty, welcomed guilt as her constant companion, of how, for Marcus Masuku, love happened under a jacaranda tree while he was listening to a story about swimming elephants, of how Valentine Tanaka became a hunchback with a heart of gold, of how Jesus came to be saved, and of how the Beaufort farm and estate knew exactly what to do with its sacrificed darlings. The Theory of Flight, Book 1, Part 1, Genealogy, Chapter 1, Genesis. Genie's beginning was like all our beginnings, beautiful and golden. After spending the night with Golide Gomede, Elizabeth Nyoni felt something give way in the space that he had come to occupy in her heart. It travelled through her body and found its way onto her mattress. When Elizabeth picked it up and placed it delicately in the palm of her right hand, she discovered that it was a shiny golden egg. It was at that moment she realized that her fate was sealed. She was bound to Golide Gomede for an eternity. Golide Gomede had been born Livingston Stanley Tikiti. But before he could be born, his parents had to meet, and before his parents could meet, their circumstances had to be such that when they did meet, they could actually do something about it. His father had been born on the Ezelweni estate and christened Bafana Ndlelapi. Bafana had had the great fortune of being born within the sphere of Mr. Chalmers' benevolence. Mr. Chalmers was a gentleman farmer and, as such, had had the time to teach the young Bafana how to read and write. He taught him these things not necessarily because he believed that the boy would be able to use the skills when he grew up, but because those were the skills he could teach the boy when he was at his leisure. As a result, Bafana grew up to be an enterprising young man who was a rare thing for his time, a moderately educated black man. Without much effort, he got a job as the assistant of a Greek traveling salesman. Because of this, he became an even rarer thing, a black man who had the opportunity to travel the length and breadth of the country. Bafana found that he loved to travel. He marveled at the often incongruous nature of his country, a raging waterfall, rocks that balanced precariously on top of one another, and a flower that looked like a roaring flame that had once upon a time caught its breath and never exhaled. He often wished he had a way to capture the many sights he saw, but all he had was his memory. In Mr. Chalmers' library, in leather-bound, sombre-looking books, were the journals of great men, David Livingstone, Thomas Baines, Henry Morton Stanley, men who had been able to record what they discovered on their travels. Bafana felt an affinity to these men, these explorers. He felt that he too was an explorer, or would have been had he not had the misfortune of being born in the wrong century. He felt that the name he had been born with, Bafana Nlelapi, which literally meant boys, which is the way, was not fit for an explorer such as himself, and so he changed it to Baines Tikiti. Tikiti, a ticket, something one purchased in order to go on a journey, something that gave one purpose. The Greek travelling salesman felt his fortune in having Baines as his assistant. Baines was a natural-born charmer who, even with the limits of language, was able to get the most miserly and frugal woman to reach into that space underneath her left breast that held the grimy handkerchief, that held the even grimier sixpence that stood between the woman and absolute poverty. There often was hesitation once the handkerchief had been brought out into the light of day, but after Baines said a few words in the seductive and universal language of commerce, the woman would smile and then nod resolutely before untying the tightest and truest knot, using her teeth and calloused blunt fingers to pry the handkerchief open and reveal the thing that she had treasured most until that very moment, the sixpence that a husband or son had laboured for in the mines, on farms, or in cities. The once frugal woman would walk away with her new treasures: an oil lamp whose leak she had not yet discovered, a smooth blanket that she did not yet know might pull after its first wash, a dress that she did not yet know was either several sizes too small or too big because she had not been allowed to try it on, a mirror whose silver edge would inevitably tarnish, then corrode and rust. Women, young and old, single and married, abandoned and widowed, loved Baines, and Baines tried to love them in return, but he loved his travel more, and as a result he broke quite a lot of hearts. This, however, did not stop him from selling cheap European trinkets to unsuspecting African women throughout the colony. Then one day Baines and the Greek travelling salesman arrived at Gol, a village that was soon to be turned into the Beaufort farm and estate, and something very surprising happened. For the first time, Baines was not able to charm a sixpence out of a woman's hand. To make matters even more mortifying, the woman did not have her sixpence tucked away under her left breast. She held it, temptingly shiny and new, between her thumb and her forefinger, ever so ready to give it away if only Baines would show her something that she liked. He showed her shoes that he claimed were of the finest Spanish leather. She was sure they would pinch. He showed her a mirror. She wondered what possible use her own reflection would be to her, since she already knew herself. He showed her a pair of pillowcases, baby soft pink with delicate lace edges. She wanted to know where the pillows that went inside the pillowcases were, a question that he had never been asked before. Not quite defeated, he showed her the one thing he thought no woman could resist, a crown fit for a queen, sparkling with rhinestones and the insincere glitter of cheap metal. She asked what kind of queen would wear a crown that only cost sixpence. It was his turn to ask questions. "What is your name?" "Prudence Ngoma." "Where are your people from?" "Here." "You obviously have travelled. Where have you been?" "The City of Kings." "Would you marry me?" An arched eyebrow let Baines know that she had heard his proposal. She asked him a question in return. "Where are you from?" "Aeleen." "I have never heard of the place." But she said this in such a way that he knew she would not mind hearing more about the place and seeing it for herself some day. They married soon after and settled in Aeleen. The temptingly shiny and new sixpence never passed from her finger to his. Baines made a concerted effort to settle, but he could not cure his wanderlust. He had to travel. He had to see the world, and having seen his country, was now yearning to see beyond its borders. Like many other young men, he left for South Africa. Unlike those young men, he was not headed towards the diamond or gold mines, but keen to do whatever job would allow him to travel. He almost immediately found a job as a travelling salesman for his master's voice gramophones. An easy job, he found, since people were enchanted by the magical machinations of a needle moving along the grooves of a black disc and making the most melodious sounds. They bought the machine without fully understanding it, but firmly believing in its magic. Prudence worried that, like many of the young men who left for South Africa, Baines would not return. Although he sent her money religiously, for 5 years it looked as though she had every reason to worry. And then one day he returned with a His Majesty's Voice gramophone under one arm. He gave it as a present to Mr. Chalmers to thank him for his ennui-induced benevolence. For Prudence, he brought the empty crook of his other arm for her to nestle her head in as she listened to his deep voice tell her tales of futures far away, so allowing her to peacefully and contentedly drift off to sleep. His eyes were wide and bright with the wonder of all he had seen in South Africa. South Africa, one country that touched 2 oceans. Imagine that! Prudence tried to imagine it, but never having seen an ocean, was not able to. There was nothing left for it but to determine that Prudence would have to see South Africa for herself. Unfortunately, Prudence had to postpone the gratification of her desire because Baines's visit had left her with the expectation of a child, a baby boy whom Baines christened, via letter, Livingstone Stanley Tikiti. Prudence waited until after her son's 2nd birthday to visit her husband. Not trusting travel the way her husband did, she left her son at home and travelled alone, eager to see Baines and the country he loved so much. However, when Prudence arrived in South Africa, she found Baines in love with something else, a contraption that, like a bird, could fly through the sky. It was called an aeroplane. In the hostel, the 4 walls of his 1-room flat were covered with pictures of this new love. Imagine being able to see the world, all the world, in a matter of days. Ships and trains were things of the past. The aeroplane was something of the future. Baines' eyes sparkled with a brilliance, and his voice was weighted by an excitement that was contagious. While in South Africa, amid all the pictures and talk of aeroplanes, Prudence was able to imagine a life there with Baines and their son, a life in which they too would, perhaps, be able to fly away some day. She went back to Aeleen and eagerly awaited the day that Baines would send for her and their son. It took Baines almost 5 years to prepare a life for his wife and son because he wanted to make sure that their lives would not only be comfortable, but also filled with travel. He bought a house in the newly built townships. He bought a bed. He bought a sofa. He bought a welcome Dover stove. He bought a very much used convertible car. He could have bought any kind of car, but it had to be a convertible, because not only did he want his family to have the best view as they travelled the country, he also wanted his family to be seen travelling the country. It was only once he was in possession of the convertible car that he sent for his wife and son. He proudly drove his convertible car, top down, all the way to the train station. But unfortunately, it was not meant to be. When Baines saw his son, he knew that he could not go travelling with him. His son's too white skin, which seemed luminescent and translucent, made him vulnerable to the elements. They would always have to travel with the top up. He watched as his son, awestruck, looked at the pictures of the aeroplanes on the walls. He watched as his son drew aeroplanes in the pages of an old His Master's Voice sales ledger. He watched as his son built model aeroplanes from the wires the workmen who had fenced the premises had left behind. Baines Tikiti was fascinated by the boy. He loved the boy, but knew that they could not share the same life. If only he had known of the boy's condition, then he would have prepared a very different life for them. Baines asked Prudence why she had never told him. Her heart breaking, she asked him why it should have mattered. His heart breaking, he sent his family back to Aeleen. Prudence could have returned home humiliated, but she did not. She returned home with only one regret, that she had not fully understood the man she had married. She also returned home unknowingly expecting another child, a daughter. When her daughter was born, she named her Menentle, I, the beautiful one. Prudence left Aeleen and returned to the place of her birth, which, during her absence, had become the Beaufort farm and estate. For his part, Livingstone Stanley Tikiti returned home with the memory of a distant father and a knowledge and understanding of flight. Baines, although he understood that he could not live the life he wanted with his family, still loved them and continued to send money home religiously. Prudence, because she cherished the son that Baines had given her, found that she could no longer return the love of a man so blinded and foolish as not to see his own son's beauty, and just as religiously sent back the money that he sent her. One day, Baines Tikiti, after receiving yet another return to sender, drove his convertible to the Indian Ocean, got out, walked into its waters, and allowed himself to be carried away by its waves, never to return. When she received the news, Prudence hoped, for his sake, that this had finally fulfilled his wanderlust. Prudence's union with Baines Tikiti had taught her one essential lesson. A person's character was the most important thing. It was all very well to be a charmer, to be able to make people love you, but charm did not have a very strong foundation. Charm was something altogether too dependent on others. Character was different. Character was something that you sowed, nurtured, grew, cultivated, and then reaped. It spoke to an inner strength. It made a life into one that was lived with purpose. Prudence raised her children to have character, to be proud and strong, to not be afraid of humility and vulnerability, to hold their heads at a particular angle, and never feel or look defeated by whatever life dealt them. And so it was, under such sage and sanguine tutelage, that Livingston Stanley Tikiti grew into a man. His self-possession made him a natural leader. His self-confidence instilled confidence in others. People gravitated towards him because he was not what they had expected him to be. They had expected him to be ashamed of his skin, to be cowed by life, to regret his circumstances. But when he held his head high, they realized just what was possible. They believed that he saw into the future, and that the future was good. He really did not have to do much, because just in being he held a promise, and people were happy to follow him. Livingston was a man who thought about things deeply and liked to see things through. So when the war came, after having thought deeply about the issue, he decided that the freedom fighters' cause was just, and that he would fight with them to the very end, or to his. To the war he took only the clothes he was wearing, his burning desire to fight injustice, the cravings of a half-full stomach, the beginnings of an unquenchable thirst, and the His Master's Voice sales ledger with all his drawings of aeroplanes. He chose as his nom de guerre, Gol Gome, which meant fields of gold, because that is what he envisioned for his people after the war. Lives of plenty, lives of comfort, lives of value, lives of substance, lives that mattered. When he shared his vision of the future with others, they were eager to follow him. But before he could become the leader of men, it just so happened that one of his camp commanders saw the ledger full of aeroplane drawings and sent him to the Soviet Union to study aeronautical engineering. Golide happily endured the cold bitterness of the Soviet climate because he understood that after the war, when independence arrived, people would need to know that they were capable of flight. When he returned, he fought with purpose and determination, and his war was good. Having been raised to be content with what he had, Golide had long felt that his life was complete. Then one day, while on a reconnaissance mission in Victoria Falls, he caught sight of a woman's ankle through the slight opening of a beer hall door. The turn of the ankle was delicate. As he moved closer, he saw that the ankle led to a foot, clad in a dangerously heavy and high red platform shoe. Having seen the ankle, Golide was no longer content with just what he had. He wanted more. He wanted that ankle to be a part of his life. There was a puff of smoke and a throaty laugh. He could not help but open the door wider, and there she was, suddenly upon him like a surprise, the woman who would determine the course of his life from that moment on. She had deep brown skin, the longest eyelashes he had ever seen, and a plumpness that his body would welcome. Her hair was plaited and parted with a precision that somehow did not belong to her. Whoever had plaited her hair had not taken the time to get to know the woman. Of this Golide was sure. The woman let a cigarette dangle precariously from her invitingly full lips, as she reached for spun golden hair that seemed to stand suspended in the air, and placed it ever so gently on her head. The golden hair made her perfect. If there was anyone else in the room, Golide did not see them. After an eternity, the woman looked at him through the mirror she was sitting in front of, took a deep drag of her cigarette, exhaled at her leisure, took the measure of him, shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly, and then stood up. As she walked past him, she said, "Waiting. That is definitely no way to treat a lady." Not auspicious words, to be sure, but she had gently rested her left hand on his shoulder as she said them, and that had been enough to seal Golide's fate. And so it began. The woman was Elizabeth Nyoni. She was a country and western singer, self-styled after Dolly Parton. She drew a large audience that spilled out of the beer hall and into the beer garden. She sang happy songs. She sang sad songs. All of them were love songs, love discovered, love lost, love regained, love unrequited, love remembered, love gone bad. And that afternoon she sang them all to him, Gol Gome, the man who, without knowing it, had kept her waiting. There was also a song about a dog, which, from the way she cut her eyes at him while she sang it, he was sure was not about a dog at all. As Golide watched the band pack away their instruments, and Elizabeth spurn the advances of hopeful would-be lovers, he felt that they had already been on a journey together through the ins and outs and highs and lows of love, that they had always already shared a life with a past, present, and future. Golide and Elizabeth did not ask much of each other. She told him that she needed to make her way to Nashville, Tennessee, so that she could become a bona fide country and western singer, and he promised that he would one day get her there. He told her that after the war he intended to make a home on the Beaufort farm and estate, and she promised that she would go ahead and prepare one for him. In all, they spent the better part of 9 hours together that day, but that was all that was needed to lay their solid foundation. After he met Elizabeth Nyoni, a part of Golide's life suddenly made sense to him. All those countless hours spent drawing and building model aeroplanes and trying to determine their aerodynamics had not been about trying to bridge the distance that his father had created, but had instead been about preparing himself to be useful in Elizabeth's life in the future. In that future, he saw himself build a giant pair of silver wings. He saw people come from all over, some fascinated, some disbelieving, some ready for him to fail, to witness him build them. Among the non-believers, he saw a few believers who looked at him with such admiration, adoration, and assurance that he knew, without a doubt, that he was a man capable of impossible things. Golide knew that building aeroplanes was a costly business, that being capable of flight would come at a price. Parts either had to be bought or manufactured, people had to be educated and trained, and the state's monopoly on manufacturing had to be destroyed and decentralized. These obstacles made Golide spend most of his time thinking of ways to make the people understand that they were still capable of flight and at no cost to themselves. The solution came to Golide one day when he looked up at the clear blue sky, saw a Vickers Viscount, and suddenly understood what was possible. This Vickers Viscount was a passenger aeroplane that flew over the Zambezi River every day. Golide decided that he would strategically shoot down the passenger aeroplane so that it would land virtually undamaged in the guerrilla camp. This way he could teach people how aeroplanes work before the war was over, before independence, at no cost. His commanders liked the idea because they could use the civilians on board as prisoners of war and hopefully broker an end to hostilities and finally realize the country that they had long been fighting for. On September 3rd, 1978, as Golide sat looking at the magnificence of the Victoria Falls, as he waited for the aeroplane to fly overhead, he thought of how Frederick Douglass had, exactly 140 years earlier, escaped from slavery. He did not think this thought in order to justify his actions. He thought it because it was a thought one could think as one waited to shoot down an aeroplane. As the Vickers Viscount flew overhead, Golide took aim with his anti-aircraft missile, and that was when they appeared with their formidable grace. Majestic, a herd of elephants raising dust beautifully in the savannah sunlight. The bull at the head of the herd raised his trunk and trumpeted terrifically, and all the elephants came to a gradual standstill on one side of the Victoria Falls. The bull dived in close to where the waters plunge over the edge and swam across the Zambezi River. The ancient river and the mighty animal were in perfect harmony. This was a rite of passage made sacred by its sheer audacity. There was a wonder to it all, the possibility of the seemingly impossible. There was this feeling that Golide got, a knowing. He became aware of his place in the world. He understood that in the grander scheme of things he was but a speck, a tiny speck, and that was enough. There was freedom, beauty even, in that kind of knowledge. It was the kind of knowledge that finally quieted you. It was the kind of knowledge that allowed you to fly. Golide launched his anti-aircraft missile. The missile was followed by a vision. He saw Elizabeth going to Beaufort Farm and Estate carrying a golden egg. The golden egg became too heavy for her, and she dropped it. It cracked open, and a girl emerged. The girl had a gap between her two front teeth, and that is how Golide knew, with edifying certainty, that he and Elizabeth had created a life together, a daughter, Imogen Zula, Genie. The Vicar's Viscount burst into glorious golden light.